and welcome to Season 3 of our podcast, The Making and the Remaking of a Codependent Mind.
At this point, we've agreed that we've pretty much summed up, for the most part, both the making and the remaking pieces of the codependency puzzle, as far as how it formed for me and how I've finally moved significantly down this path of healing. There's still plenty of work to do every day to be sure that I keep myself on this path, and it's still not always easy, but the longer I demonstrate to myself that I can consistently be my authentic self, the more foreign the old me seems.
One of my favorite podcasters or authors or thought leaders, I don't know how to describe her exactly, psychotherapist Esther Perel has this great quote. It's kind of her mantra. The quality of our relationships determines the quality of our lives. One of the things that we've talked about as part of what makes codependency so insidious and so difficult to overcome is that the behavior habits that are part of codependency undermine our ability to form healthy, intimate relationships.
That was absolutely the case for me. Those habits got me trapped in abusive and unhealthy relationships, and they kept me from forming more deep connections with healthy people. So even after healing the trauma and kicking the codependent habits, which again I feel like I've largely done, I still need to learn how to navigate healthy relationships.
And all of us have a lot to learn about that, myself included. Knowing ourselves and knowing each other is a lifelong journey. And doing this podcast has been a great tool for me and for us to learn more about ourselves and each other.
And there's been a lot of terms and concepts that have come up in our discussions and the research that we've done that we didn't have the chance to really explore in as much depth as we might have liked, just because we were somewhat focused on my story.
So this season, we're going to devote episodes to individual topics that we think have the possibility to help us understand better and navigate more effectively healthy relationships and to improve the quality of our relationships and therefore the quality of our lives. We're going to start with the idea of boundaries.
Yes, and although before we start, if there's anything that you, the listeners, feel we've left out of my story or we're kind of hoping we'd expand on, please let us know. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram by searching Codependent Mind. And as always, if you are enjoying the show, we would appreciate a like or review on your podcast platform of choice.
So I wanted to start with the idea of boundaries because this is a somewhat new concept for me, but you see it everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all over.
It's like a buzzword.
It's all over Instagram. You know, if you read advice columns, which I do, I really like advice columns. They're always talking about boundaries, setting boundaries, respecting boundaries. And again, I don't think I really even heard the concept in terms of relationships before a few years ago. So it's kind of like, it's so prevalent now.
Yeah.
How do we manage to talk about relationships before we knew this idea of boundaries? Because how do we navigate our relationships without boundaries? Because it's everywhere now. It seems like critical to healthy, respectful relationships.
Right. It's putting a term to something that I think was always there, but it's like it's always helpful to come up to find these terms.
Yeah, it must be an incredibly helpful term because again, it's so well used. But the problem becomes it is so used that it becomes a little unclear as to what problem exactly it's trying to solve.
Well, yeah, and that can be kind of frustrating. At least it has been for me sometimes when I'm researching this stuff and listening to podcasts and different things and hearing these terms, and then they're just kind of brushed over, and it's like, oh, there's that again. They're using that term again. And once I started looking to it was amazing at how foreign it was, this idea, for me at least. But like you said, it's something that can and should be there for every single relationship, not just romantic relationships, but every interpersonal relationship. How would you describe briefly what you think boundaries means?
I think it's actually helpful to pull back a little bit in terms of what we want the concept boundaries to encompass. So to go back to what I take to be the original metaphor or analogy.
Mm-hmm.
We're taking this word or concept, boundaries, which has been around forever.
Yeah, sure.
And we're applying it to interpersonal relationships.
Right.
So let's go back to, we usually just use the word to use, and that was like a demarcation, kind of legal or political or geographic,
Mm-hmm.
between two autonomous entities.
Sure. Entities or land masses or
Yeah.
borders between countries and things.
Yeah, right. So it was used to distinguish a difference between one entity and another entity. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's a country or the boundaries of a forest.
Yeah, sure. I think part of that original idea of boundaries when it comes to things like land masses and things like that is there is a negotiation between those different entities also. So there's...
I agree. Although before there's negotiation, there has to be this sense of differentiation.
Yeah, sure. Right. Where does one end and the other begin?
That there is two.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't have a boundary unless you have two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least, there has to be two separate things.
Yeah, right.
And I think this is why boundaries come up a lot in codependency, because people who were trained as codependents were never given the opportunity to establish themselves as a separate being.
Yeah, right. So this whole enmeshment and combining yourself into this other person, sort of just, it's a natural fall away that boundaries would just not be there because...
And you don't feel that you have the right to your own feelings or emotions.
Right.
You always have to kind of check with the other person.
Mm-hmm.
But one way I think to recapture a healthy sense of boundaries is to kind of imagine it as this physical line, as this physical demarcation. So you literally are physically
yeah, I like that.
another person.
Yeah. So that's a good place to start. Yeah,
It's
we are two separate people.
It's a good place to start in the physical realm.
Mm-hmm.
So to take that metaphor and to apply it to your physical body.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a quotation that I thought it was the philosopher John Stuart Mill. Other people attribute it to Oliver Wendell Holmes. The right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins, which is another way of saying each of us have absolute right over our own physical body.
Sure.
And other people's rights or privileges stop there.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the easiest boundary violation to kind of understand and, as you say, kind of start with.
Yeah.
That no one is allowed to do things to your body that you do not explicitly and freely invite or allow them to do.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we're talking about physical boundary here, but then now this explodes out into the whole emotional realm and interpersonal realm.
Right. So once you feel comfortable with that, which even there, as a codependent, you did not feel comfortable even with that boundary initially.
Right. Well,
other people were allowed to tell you what to do to your body.
Right.
And with your body.
Yeah.
And you felt you had to do it. So I want to make sure that we agree on this and understand, because I think people have struggled even with that, with that sense that they have absolute autonomy over their own physical being.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, I think that was true for me, that I didn't feel like I had maybe just the base level of self-respect to where I felt like I had autonomy over even my own body.
You've told me stories, for instance, about sending you to the doctor in order to talk about getting your feet fixed, or
yeah, sure, or my my mouth or my nose or something because I was breathing improperly.
Yeah, and both R and J kind of demanding or expecting that you take drugs. Disguised as medicine, but really, I mean, they were not prescribed drugs, but take drugs in order to solve physical problems that they had with you that you did not feel were problems.
Yeah, and I remember clearly just reflexively doing these things, not liking it and resenting them for it.
Right.
But doing them.
But doing things to your body.
Yeah.
That you didn't want to do. So yeah, I mean, the physical, again, lots of people even struggle with that initial one, but I think conceptually that's perhaps the easiest one to recognize, that you don't have to do anything with your body.
Right.
That you do not expressly want to
Yeah,
do.
it's our own choice, right? Yeah, I mean, you may decide you agree with it, but that's up to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then, of course, like you said, that's a great place to start. And then from there, it just can explode out into this whole web of emotional needs and intellectual needs. And
right. So then we have, so that's needs. Physical autonomy, right?
Yeah.
We all have physical autonomy. We all have the right to control what happens with our body.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's emotional autonomy.
Yeah.
Which also I think people with codependent habits struggle with.
Yeah.
And, in some ways we all struggle with.
Yeah, it's not easy, really. I don't think, I mean, can you think of times where it was difficult for you to set or at least enforce boundaries? I mean, I guess we'll talk more about what that looks like, enforcing boundaries, but...
Right, because it's a little bit easier with the physical metaphor to imagine how you can enforce those boundaries. Mm-hmm. By physically separating yourself from the situation or by physically refusing, understanding that can be problematic in some situations. Mm-hmm. But just to go to before we talk about enforcement, what does an emotional boundary look like?
Yeah. What's an example of one that you can remember having?
Well, I think I have a lot of emotional boundaries, right? So, so if you think about someone physically violating your space, so people also will try to emotionally violate your space. So people, for instance, swearing at me or yelling at me,
sure.
Berating me,
mm-hmm.
That's an emotional intrusion, right? They're trying to make me feel afraid or belittled or controlled.
Yeah.
They're trying to use their emotions to control my emotions. Mm-hmm. And that's a situation where you have to feel comfortable saying no, mm-hmm. You're not allowed to talk to me like that. Mm-hmm. You're not allowed to try to make me afraid.
Right. Yeah. So you have this kind of base expectations of how you expect to be treated or want to be treated. Mm-hmm. And then you get to make the choice what happens when someone doesn't treat you that way.
So the emotional boundary, I think, again, is the same as the physical boundary in that you have the right to prevent incursions into your emotional space. Mm-hmm. No one has the right to demand that you feel a certain way.
Yeah.
Or to try to enforce or create feelings in you. Mm-hmm. That you don't want.
Right.
Including, if you're feeling sad, no one has the right to try to demand or force or pressure you into not feeling sad.
Yeah, right. And, what I've found, though, is it's almost like it's a negotiation between people's competing boundaries almost. Some people may have what I would kind of consider unhealthy boundaries, where what we're talking about here is they're expecting you to behave the way they want to behave, and they may actually think that's a boundary for mine. I want this person to not be sad, so I'm going to try to make them not be sad or expect them to not be sad.
How is that? How do you see that setting a boundary? So what's an example for you for someone setting an unhealthy boundary?
Well,
like literally just an example, not
an example would just be
to do it to me. Set an unhealthy boundary.
I need you to go to sleep at the same time as me, because we need to be in sync. I need my sleep. I don't want you waking me up if you go to bed late. So
if you said a boundary that I'm setting is that you go to bed the same as I.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I think this is why we're talking about. This is what I was talking about when I was saying like let's reduce boundaries to a more minimalistic mm-hmm. expression of the idea. Because that sounds to me like an overreach. That sounds to me like a misuse of boundaries.
Yeah, right, sure.
In that case, what you would be trying to do is an incursion into my space, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. into my physical boundaries, to my emotional boundaries,
right?
Disguised as your own boundary setting, but really that's an invasion.
Yes, exactly. I know. The reason why I brought that up is because I think that's how a lot of people may think of boundaries sometimes. Like there's just like, I expect this, so I'm going to expect that you obey this more or less. And that's
right. They
my
turn boundary setting into rules. Boundaries are not rules. Those are two different things.
Yes, exactly.
So boundaries, again, are protecting your own mm-hmm. physical and emotional and psychological autonomy.
Yeah.
They're not about getting other people to behave the way you want to behave.
Right. Yeah, it's completely up to each individual to honor their own boundaries.
And you honor your own boundaries by refusing to the best of your ability to accept incursions into your physical autonomy, your emotional autonomy, and your psychological autonomy. It's your responsibility.
So that kind of brings us to the topic of enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? I mean, what does that look like to you as far as how do you know, what's an example of enforcing a boundary for you?
I mean, I think the best example and the most straightforward one, not easy, but straightforward, is to leave.
Yeah.
You leave the room.
Mm-hmm.
You leave the relationship.
Yeah.
You leave the conversation.
Yeah.
It's straightforward. Again, it's not easy.
Right.
And we want to recognize that sometimes it's not possible.
Yeah, sure. Or extremely difficult. And yes.
But it's difficult because it's important.
Yeah.
There are risks to having boundaries because there are people out there who want to violate them.
Mm-hmm.
Narcissist being one.
Yeah.
Obvious one.
Right.
They want to have power over your physical body, over your emotional life,
mm-hmm.
over your mental life, over your sexual life. They want to treat everything you have as resources to them.
Right.
So you can think of again as boundaries between countries.
Mm-hmm.
They're like Russia and everyone's Ukraine, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want to take over. And so it can be very risky to set boundaries because there are going to be people who are going to be angry and upset with you.
Backlash.
Because they want the resources that you have, emotional, physical, intellectual, or perhaps sexual. They want those resources for themselves.
Yeah. I mean, that's an extreme version. But then there's also, I think, healthy versions of where setting boundaries can be risky or another word for it, vulnerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because we are separate individuals and we may have different ideas about what we want, and those things might not line up. And so one of us may have a boundary that the other person's like, well, that's not a boundary for me, or actually I kind of expect the opposite.
Yeah, but that's what I'm wondering if we're getting into talking about wants and needs and expectations rather than boundaries.
Okay.
So, right, when two people come together, but they remain two separate entities that then have to live together. And the boundary between them is only one part of that. There's still a whole bunch of negotiation that has to be done.
Right.
How and when and why to cross those boundaries. What resources to share across those boundaries.
Right.
What expectations or needs independent of the boundary.
Well, yeah, that's why I think the boundaries are going to be totally different depending on the relationship, So casual relationships of everyday people you come across may be different than a boundary that you have with an intimate partner.
I don't think so much. I think the boundary remains the same. The boundary is your physical, emotional, and psychological autonomy. That is maintained in any relationship you go in.
Sure.
You may allow people to interact with your boundary. You may, cross the boundary more easily.
Yeah, sure.
For instance, we see in terms of sexual relationships.
Yeah, right.
I'm going to allow some people to have a sexual relationship and me not others.
Yeah. Well, isn't that kind of a boundary that so with certain types of people, my boundary is this for sexual, interaction, and my boundary with this type of relationship is different.
I see that my boundary is always the same. I have complete control over my sexual life.
Yeah. Okay.
Other people can only do things to me and with me sexually that I explicitly allow.
Yeah.
or invite.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm going to allow and invite different things from different people.
Right. So I think
this is why I'm saying I think the boundaries are overused, right? So, and you were kind of saying how it is misused, like every need or expectation is
somehow a boundary. Right.
But I think boundaries should really be reserved for things that are done to you that violate your physical autonomy, your emotional autonomy, your psychological autonomy, your physical space.
Yeah.
Such that if it happens without your consent or invitation, that's a violation, and that's an unhealthy and unsafe person, situation, relationship.
Right. What does it look like to you when say someone you love has crossed a boundary of yours and you have to make a decision what to do about that. And you found yourself compromising your boundaries.
It's hard. It is hard when someone makes an incursion that I feel violates, again, my physical autonomy or my emotional autonomy. It's hard to know how severely to react to that.
Right. So, I mean, an example that pops in my head is like, say, when I was dishonest with you in the past and things like that.
Well, I see. I don't see that as a boundary. I don't like it.
Yeah. So you don't see honesty as a boundary necessarily, like. No.
I mean, for me, again, I'm using boundaries in a more restricted way. Mm-hmm. I have expectations of honesty in a relationship.
Yeah.
Because it demonstrates respect for me, respect for our relationship. It is, I think, critical for intimacy and trust and safety.
Yeah. But you wouldn't call it a boundary.
I wouldn't call it a boundary. People, I imagine, lie to me all the time.
Sure. Right.
And a lot of the time, I don't care. Public figures lie to me, not directly at me. But so, for instance, this, I think, is why abuse can be so problematic, because there can be one instance of someone crossing my boundaries.
Yeah.
Like flipping out at me and swearing at me and calling me names.
Yeah.
That to me is a boundary violation. That's, again, an incursion on my emotional life, an invasion of my emotional life, trying to make me feel scared or upset. Right. Or, another one would be consistently denying my feelings. If I say I'm sad or I'm upset by this, and that's dismissed or belittled, or I'm shamed for that.
Yeah. And these things have happened to you over the course of your life.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so,
I mean, not to the extent maybe they happened to you in those kind of obviously abusive relationships, but they can happen in a lot of relationships. And again, it's hard to know how seriously to take that and to see, to recognize whether that is serious enough to say this is an unsafe, unhealthy person, relationship, or situation.
Yeah.
Or if this was just a one-time thing, which often people who are abusive will go to great lengths as a one-time thing, or they'll try to gaslight you that it wasn't a boundary violation. Yeah. But I think the important thing to recognize for the individual is to say, yes, that was a boundary violation.
Sure.
That was a violation of me.
Yeah. Start from there. So
from there.
You're like, okay, I have a benchmark now. I know that was a violation.
I know that was a violation. That person was doing it to me. I am a separate person. I have the right to feel what I feel, to control my own body, to control my own thoughts. And that person is trying to impose themselves on me.
Yeah.
And that's not okay. So you start there. Yeah. Then you can decide what to do with it.
Yeah. Where do you go next?
How serious it is. What making yourself safe in that situation looks like.
Yeah. Does it start with communicating with that person and saying, hey, that crossed my boundary and here's why. And then seeing what their reaction is. So, you're right. Holy crap. That was a total mistake. That's not me. I swear I won't do that again. Whatever it is.
I know. I mean,
obviously anyone can say that.
Yeah,
anyone can say
it's hard.
But then it comes down to like, okay, well, if you're willing to go, okay, well, that crossed my boundary. They seem to recognize that. I appreciate what they said. Maybe I'll give them another chance.
Yeah.
Maybe I won't. It's totally up to you.
It's totally up to you. And it's absolutely okay to call it a day on the first boundary violation. But I think it is important to make this distinction between violating people's boundaries and then not meeting their expectations or desires or wants.
Well, that's because good. That's not something I was thinking about when I was thinking about boundaries. So I like that you brought that up.
Because it's also absolutely okay to have expectations and wants and needs. And if other people don't meet those in relationships, to decide that relationship is not the one for you.
Yeah, right.
And we don't have to recast that into something that the other person did wrong, right? Sure. That they violated your boundary because they decided that they fill in the blank. Actually did like to travel, or actually did like to drink alcohol occasionally, or decided to take up smoking. I mean, these are all decisions that those people are allowed to make. Yeah. That you might say, I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who smokes, or I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who's constantly traveling, or
and then now you're in a negotiation because then the other person's
now
like,
you're
oh, really? Okay, well, maybe I don't need to do that then.
Maybe this relationship is more important than this activity, or maybe not. I mean, maybe this activity is important to me, and in which case, it is your responsibility.
Yeah.
The person who says, I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who drinks, if that person decides that alcohol is part of their lives, it is your responsibility to leave.
Yeah, right.
You're not enforcing a boundary. This is kind of what we were saying before, by demanding that other people change their behavior.
Yeah, right. So
if it's not directed at you.
Yeah.
Like, boundaries are about protecting yourself.
Yeah.
So it's got to be directed at you. It can't just be something you don't like.
Yeah, so where would you place, say, the negotiation of sexual fidelity, like monogamy versus not monogamy?
I think for me, that's totally an expectation.
Yeah.
Or want or need, along that line, right?
Right.
Those
and
are all
hopefully it's
different
one
things.
You've communicated at some point before.
Yes, right.
One of you decides to do something that is kind of generally recognized as behavior that doesn't fall into
that
one of
needs
those
absolutely to be communicated about, because the needs are expectations. It's like, so I need this in a relationship, or I expect it, or I want it, and then you tell me.
Right.
If you also have a similar expectation or need or want, if you don't, then we need to either negotiate or make a decision about whether this is a relationship that we want or need. But your feelings about sexual fidelity and sexual monogamy are not an incursion on mine.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Like have your own emotional autonomy and emotional feelings about that.
Yeah. I really like this train of thought here, because I think I was applying boundaries to too many things myself. Once again, as I said, this was kind of a foreign concept to me, and I went from having none to now suddenly applying it to almost everything.
Right. So one thing that was helpful to me is having babies. I have 2 children, and when they were babies, they had no sense of boundaries, right?
Yeah, sure.
Like, my body was their wonderland. They would, so they would poke, prod, attach themselves to me at will. And same with them for me, right? They had really no physical autonomy. They were completely physically dependent on me. We were very emotionally enmeshed, right? As babies and mothers are, and they're supposed to be, such that, any kind of emotional reaction I had produced a counter reaction in them. Similarly, they were very good at producing emotional reactions in me. But this is, one thing that happens as they grow, obviously, is those boundaries start to be enforced. Yeah. You start to no, you can't touch mommy there, or you can't be in the room while mommy's
So
going to the bathroom. And similarly, you teach them, hopefully, both by explicitly and by modeling it, that they have physical autonomy. They have emotional autonomy. They get to make decisions about their physical and emotional and very much so sexual life and psychological life. They get to have their own opinions. I don't get to enforce that. I don't get to make them think the same way as I do about situations. I don't get them to make them feel the same way as I do about situations.
Yeah, so it's a natural part of the maturation process is separating yourself and becoming an individual, figuring out who you are and what sets you apart and what you want and what these boundaries are. But like you're saying, it's just recognize I have the right to my own self, my own space, my own emotional landscape. And when you're a baby, that's difficult to really
we have no power, because it's tied to, and we've talked a lot about in this podcast, it's tied to this idea of autonomy and personal power. We say people have boundaries, or they don't have boundaries. Codependents don't have boundaries, but everyone has boundaries.
Yeah, right.
We have a physical body that is a boundary, and that should not be violated without our consent. Right. And so we also have an emotional life and a psychological life, and that should not be violated without our consent. So we all have those boundaries.
Yeah, even people with codependent behaviors.
Yep. Yeah, they have it. They just have no mechanism for enforcing it.
Yes, exactly.
If you're with healthy people, they're going to respect those boundaries. But then unhealthy people will violate at will if you let them. They just will.
Yeah, if they say they can.
If they see they can, they will.
Yeah.
So when we say that people with codependent behaviors struggle with boundaries, I think it's that they struggle with the feeling that they have the right to their own emotional, psychological, physical autonomy.
Yeah.
And then even when they feel they have the right, they struggle with the potential consequences of asserting that right. Boundaries are something that need to be enforced.
Yeah.
Just like rights are something that needs to be asserted and protected.
Yeah, and I understand it. Effectively, it looks as though people with codependent behaviors don't have boundaries. I mean, in my case, I can just remember doing everything I could to feel okay that these boundaries were crossed, to where I completely ignored that they even existed. So if I had to deal with the fact that every day someone was violating boundaries, going, oh, they violated a boundary, ouch, and then having to be conscious of that every single day. So yeah, it's kind of creating this structure.
Right, that was the writing stories,
Yeah.
which we talked about, that you would write a story as if it wasn't a violation. You invited it.
Yeah.
You invited them in,
Right.
which is fine, right? Again, you can invite people to cross boundaries.
Yeah.
Come on in. And so you would make it such that it was your idea, or you agree to it.
Or they're right. They're absolutely right. So it's, yes, it's fine. Maybe the delivery was a little off, but that's okay, like that. But yeah, someone may have, like you said, someone may have a boundary. They may be uncomfortable with physical touch, or, certain types of physical touch, but they may not want to be that way, and they want to try to train themselves to be okay with it. So you may invite a boundary cross. Like, okay, normally I don't like when you rub my shoulder, but I'm going to say, go ahead and do it now.
Yeah. Well, again, if you think of our whole physical bodies are absolutely a boundary.
Yep.
But to the extent of which you like that boundary to be interacted with. Or some people might put, for them emotionally and physically, the boundary might be like 6 feet away from their physical body. Right. So the boundary that's expressed in their own body, it extends a little bit beyond their body.
And there could be certain emotional conversations that maybe certain people are just, they don't feel as though they can handle. Maybe they're not ready for. Maybe the timing is wrong.
Yep. And they should have the absolute right to say,
I can't talk about that.
I can't talk about that. So to kind of sum up, my thinking on this is that the concept boundaries is most helpful in interpersonal relationships when it's reserved for a set of behaviors that violates your personal autonomy, your emotional autonomy, your psychological autonomy, your spiritual autonomy, that essentially tries to control another person, trying to control what happens within you.
Right.
And separating that from what is negotiable.
Yeah, sure.
Wants, needs, expectations within.
Right. And trajectory of a relationship or something, it's like, so things like that all falls under the negotiation of one's needs and desires. So how fast someone wants to go with various things in a relationship, and so certain expectations they have at the beginning are going to be different than 1 year in or 2 years in, and things like that. Yeah,
ideally, like, boundaries shouldn't shift that much.
Yeah, right.
Again, true. You can. Yeah. There's some wiggle room, like we were talking about. Like, some people, their physical boundary might be, this kind of space around them. Some people might be touching them, but the boundary should be relatively stable. Your needs and wants and expectations will change dramatically.
Yeah. Well, when you say that, the wiggle room on because, the example I gave about, like, someone may have just kind of a trauma trigger about being touched a certain way, but they may be working through that and trying to work towards not having that. And it could be the same thing with emotional triggers. And so I may have a boundary, like, I can't talk about this particular thing right now. This makes me extremely uncomfortable and it triggers me or something. But I don't necessarily want to be that way forever. And it is up to you whether you want to, okay, well, it's...
But the main thing there is it's kind of the same boundary. You're saying, I'm not emotionally prepared to have this conversation.
Right.
The kind of conversation may change.
Yes, exactly.
Such that there may be at some point there's no conversation.
Right. So maybe that's getting too granular to try to, like, keep moving the goalpost of the boundary.
So the goalpost is respecting. You need to respect my emotional autonomy, my physical autonomy, etc.
Yeah.
Such that I have the final say.
Yeah.
On those issues. Yeah. On my feelings, my body, my spiritual life, my intellectual life. I have the final say. I am the authority within the boundary of me. The boundaries are me, and you're not allowed to violate. But right, in terms of how that's expressed, that can vary very wildly.
Yeah, day to day, hour to hour.
Yeah.
I read a lot about people talking about boundaries constantly changing. You need to be flexible, and your boundaries are changing. But what we just talked about here, in which I really like your explanation of being, it's not the boundary really that's changing. It's the kind of the framework behind the boundaries, really more the wants, needs, desires, or just kind of your emotional landscape. Where are you at a given moment, or and it's not that you need to be constantly trying to think of oh, this is my boundary now. It's more just my boundary is always just to be an autonomous human being,
autonomous and safe, right?
Yeah. And so what? Then the nuances of that at any given moment are going to change. But I don't have to redefine my boundary because today I'm feeling depressed or something, and I don't feel like doing X.
I like the scene from one of the Star Trek movies. I can't remember which one it is. Maybe you're more of a Trekkie. Maybe you'll remember the one with the Borg, where Captain Picard is talking about giving up the Enterprise.
Yeah.
And he gives the speech where, I can't quote it exactly, but something to the effect that the Borg take over worlds and we fall back.
Right.
They move into new universes and we fall back. No more.
Right.
The line is drawn here.
Right.
So he drew the line at the Enterprise. That's to me, that's the boundary. Like what
Sure.
The Enterprise is at this point a metaphor for yourself, your autonomous selfhood. That's where you draw the line.
Yeah.
Like you can make compromises and negotiations.
Right. And you may not be successful. Someone may invade, someone may attack you, which
is horrible. And that's traumatic. I mean, that causes trauma. I mean, literally, I think that's a major piece of trauma when you're repeatedly violated.
Yeah.
But so reserving boundaries for that Enterprise moment. It's like, I'm not giving up the ship.
Right.
And if you try to make me, you're in for a fight.
Yeah.
Whatever that looks like.
Right.
Hopefully that just looks like I leave.
Right. Yeah.
But if it doesn't, I'm going to fight for that.
Yeah.
For myself. And I think that's the struggle for a lot of codependent people.
Yeah.
To fight because it's been so scary in the past.
Yeah. So it's defaulting back to this position of powerlessness because, that's what I had to do to protect myself.
Yeah. Do you feel at this point prepared to draw your line and to fight for it?
Yes, I do. Yeah, and actually I have examples of having done that over the course of the last year or two throughout this process. The process of everything we were talking about in the podcast and throughout the making of the podcast. I feel it getting stronger. I more conscious, and yes, I just feel confident in my ability to make that choice. Do what I feel is necessary to either exercise power when I feel like I have power or exercise the power of acceptance when I don't.
So that's kind of our take on boundaries. If other people have different ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Again, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram or by email, codependentmind@gmail.com.
We'll have more topics like this in the coming episodes. We hope you join us.